Well, you just took one needle movement and a 1 RL for all your permanent makeup, and now you're wondering why all your work on older clients is terrible? The truth is, there's 5 reasons this can happen, so today I'm going to stop you making these face-wrecking mistakes. Most brow courses aren't long enough to cover all the different types of skin you're going to come across as a PMU artist, so you can be left messing up people's faces, not knowing what you're doing wrong or how to change it. To get the best results on mature skin, you first need to know what happens to skin as we age. Many artists struggle with mature women's brows healing cool with grey or bluish results. We absolutely can avoid this easily. We just need to understand why it happens. As people, particularly women after menopause age, the skin becomes much thinner. The thinner the skin, the more we can see the vascular system, which is cool in appearance. Nearly all the natural warmth of your skin will be gone by the time you're 40. Now, I'm not saying 40's old, but biology's a bitch and it's true. So you need to treat all older clients as cool. The thinner the skin, the cooler the client. Think of it as laying a net curtain with a cool tint to it over the pigment. The coolness in the curtain distorts the colour of the pigment slightly and makes it look cooler under the skin. This may mean you have to counteract this by adding a little bit of warmth to your pigment. And this shifting of the colour slightly by adding coolness or warmth is known as modification. It's quite easy to get this modification process really wrong though, and that's one of the reasons there were so many really orange and red brows on people's faces. People were messing this up. Let me explain. How you modify will depend on the type of pigment you use, and so many artists get this wrong. If you're using strong pigments with a lot of carbon, that carbon outlasts most of the other colorants, and they can look grey or blue after a while. So for these pigments, you really do need to add a lot of warmth to balance the tone of them long term. However, I don't think you should be using these powerful pigments on your much older clients anyway. I don't mean 40s, it's not old, don't come after me. We're implanting pigments in the upper layer of the dermis, and if you think of the skin as a sponge, it can only take so much pigment before it looks overfull. The thinner your client's skin, the less sponge they have, the quicker this oversaturation can happen. It's so much harder to implant mineral-based pigments compared to carbon-based pigments, and you generally lose 40% of the colour in the healing process. But in the case of older clients who can easily oversaturate, that's going to work in your favour, leading to much softer results. But in our much older clients, this still might not be enough to stop oversaturated results, and that's where mistake number 3 comes in. Even if we use the softest, most natural pigments, some older skin may be so thin that we can still overdo the colour and get too bold a result. I always think it's best to err on the side of caution. I'd rather see a client for an extra session than be sending them for laser removal. So what's the alternative? Using dilution in your pigments, even the soft mineral ones, is a wise move. You're really cutting down the risk of messing up. Always use the correct dilutant for your pigment brand, and I tend to dilute up to 50% until I've seen the first session healed. I can then assess if I need to change anything from there. Dilution really is very important because the way more mature skin behaves will mean that we'll have to change our needle technique too. If we look at a 1 RL, it's incredibly sharp. All the pressure is focused on that tiny needle, which makes it prone to traumatizing older, thinner skin. To implant properly without blowouts and scarring, I always go for a bigger needle. I'd probably start at a 3RS or maybe a 5RS. The larger the configuration, and the fact that shader needles are more spaced out due to having more space between them, makes them less traumatic on the skin. However, using multiple needles at once means you're going to pack in more colour quicker, so be mindful of how you're working. You may have to use movements such as pointillism or circles to implant colour quickly. These are the least traumatic techniques. My motto for older skin is get in and get out. I'm not trying to produce Instagrammable pixels. I'm trying to get the best result for my client with the least chance of scarring. Your needles and movements are not the only technique you will need to alter to make sure you don't damage the skin. And this one might surprise you. You will always hear in PMU that the stretch of the skin is so important, and it is. But with mature skin, to make sure we implant properly, we need to change things up with your stretch too. Imagine this piece of paper is young skin, and the pen is the needle trying to implant pigment. If we don't stretch it, it doesn't implant properly. As soon as we get a good stretch, we get good solid results. Well, let's assume that this tissue paper is much older skin. It's much more fragile. So if we stretch this as hard as we would the younger skin, look what happens. When working on older skin, do stretch, but just nowhere near as hard. You find that you can implant so much easier. As you're implanting into the skin that is so much more fragile, it's even more important to make sure that your needle tech is completely on point, pardon the pun. There are needle mistakes so many people are making that will have terrible consequences on more mature skin, and they're so easy to fix. So this next video will make sure you're not making them.